Well, if you don't know, my name is Ashley O'Hara. I'm the curator at the Crested Butte Museum, and welcome to our episode on water in Colorado with Dr. Duane Vandenbusche tonight. I'd like to start off the evening by giving a land acknowledgement. The museum does recognize that we are guests here on this land, historically Ute territory. We acknowledge that the Uncompahgre Ute and the Tabewash Ute were forcibly removed from this area due to the Bruneau Treaty. We hope that you will take time to visit our neighbor, the Ute Museum, located in Montrose, Colorado, with exhibits developed in partnership with the Ute tribes by History Colorado and our State Historic Society. While we could never do this history justice, we do include information about Paleo Indians of the Gunnison Valley, the Ute people, the Bruneau Treaty, and the Los Pinos Indian Agency in our exhibits. Other ways to support Indigenous peoples today and of the past is to go beyond just this land acknowledgement. Please consider taking steps towards allyship and reconciliation by conducting your own research of the Indigenous groups that were forcibly removed from your own communities by visiting local museums, cultural centers, and reading literature from Indigenous writers. We also hope that you will consider becoming members or making a donation to support this program and all the work that we do here at the museum. You can do this by visiting our website, crestedbuttemuseum.com, or calling us at the museum. Currently, we are only doing private walking tours that you can give a call to the museum. I'm also going to plug in, we are doing a ghost story night at the museum next Thursday, October 28th. It's going to start at 6 p.m. and go till about 7:45. It's $30 for members and $40 for non-members. Glo Cunningham, Barbara Mason, Ellen Osterling, and Belladonna and others are going to just chat about their ghost stories about the museum and Crested Butte itself. And just let you all know that this program is being recorded and will be available at crestedbuttemuseum.com or our YouTube page. If you have any questions about our programming, you can visit our webpage as well. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram. We have a TikTok now, and we also list our events in the newspaper as well. I also want to thank our lead sponsors, Western Colorado University Foundation, Bill Petros, and Bud Bush from Bluebird Realty. We'll have time for questions at the end of the talk when we do the trivia, and you can post your questions in the chat in the Q&A. Okay, it's all you, Duane.
All right, thank you very much, Ashley. A couple of announcements now for everybody on board. Next week, we will meet on Wednesday, October 27th, because they've got the ghost stories going on Thursday. So mark that down if you would. Next Wednesday, the 27th, we'll meet for our 8th presentation of Colorado history. This is number 7 tonight. We're going to be talking about water. Now, next Wednesday, we're going to have a very special performance, and it's going to involve music in Colorado, highlighted by Pete Dunda and his accordion. And we're going to be involved in a lot of polkas and waltzes and music in Colorado. So I want everybody to have their dancing shoes on, because we're going to give some lessons on the waltz and the polka. We were up there with Pete a couple of nights ago, and Ashley did pretty well. Catherine Keller did pretty well. Melinda Holm did pretty well.
I think Melinda was the best.
Yeah, so that is the traditional dance of Crested Butte, and it's going to be a lot of fun. We're also going to play the 2 state songs, which are Where the Columbines Grow and Moonlight on the River, Colorado. And so it ought to be a great time. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you will too. So that's next Wednesday on next week on the 27th, same time at 7 o'clock. Now, before we get started on water tonight, I want to tell you that I was down on the Blue Mesa Reservoir about a week ago with my friend Bruce Bartleson, and we were able to drive 3 miles from the Lake City Bridge along the highway. We could have driven right down on the bottom of the reservoir 3 miles before the water backed up. The reservoir right now is 26% full. That's the 2nd lowest ever. And the Gunnison River is flowing about like it did when I got here in 1962 without the dams. Now, before we get started, I'm going to give everybody 4 great books on water. in the West and Colorado. One of them is by a man named Norris Hundley, and it's called Water in the West. And he talks primarily about the famous Colorado River Compact. We're going to talk about that tonight. Another one is Mark Reisner, R-E-I-S-N-E-R, and it's called the Cadillac Desert. Another one is written by a man named John Kuhn, K-U-H-N, and it's called Science Be Damned. And the last one is by a man named Botticelli, and it's called Water, a Biography. So those are some of the great books that you can read as we get into the water lecture tonight. So I'm going to start off by just saying this. When one thinks of Colorado, we think primarily of railroads, mining, ranching, and mountains. All have had a colorful and important role to play in Colorado. But water, not as sexy, has always been the most important. Nothing comes close to water, and we're going to take a look at that tonight. John Wesley Powell, and there he is, the one-armed explorer of the Colorado River in 1869. John Wesley Powell in 1877 said that the history of the American West will be determined by acre-feet of water. He was right on. Zebulon Pike, exploring the southern reaches of the Louisiana Purchase Territory, 1806 and 7, declared that much of it was a near desert. Stephen Long, during his 1819 and 20 expedition in the West and Colorado, referred to the area he had been through as the Great American Desert, fit only for jackrabbits, prairie dogs, rattlesnakes, certainly not fit for human habitation. In 1877, John Wesley Powell wrote a great analysis of the American West, and it was entitled Arid Regions of the West. 8 years earlier, he was the first man to go down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. Powell understood the West better than anybody before him and probably better than anybody after him. And he made the following points. Number one, he said, there is not plenty more where that came from. He became one of the great conservationists of the West. And he said that the nation had to take care of its water and land and timber, all of its resources. They were not inexhaustible. Secondly, he said, much of the land in the American West was not suitable for farming because of the lack of water. And he said, if one does farm, irrigation would exactly be essential for success. Number three, he said, ranching was the natural way of making a living in much of the West. Millions of buffalo had once existed in many numbers on the tall grass of the Great Plains, and cattle could do the same. Number five, he mentioned the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave 160 acres of federal land for farming. And he said it didn't work. It didn't work in arid Colorado or the West. In fact, he said you probably couldn't raise one cow on the arid 160 acres. And finally, he said, there was only one agency able to build gigantic irrigation projects and reclamation projects that would be necessary for success in Colorado and the West, and that was the federal government. Powell went on to become the father of government bureaus designed to do just that. The Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Soil Conservation Service, the Bureau of Mines, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Park Service, and the United States Geological Survey. Walter Prescott Webb, a young professor at the University of Texas in 1922, read Emerson Huff's book called The Way West, in which Huff said that the West had been settled by the rifle, the horse, the axe, and the boat. Walter Prescott Webb knew that it might have been settled by the rifle and the horse, but it sure as hell wasn't settled by the axe and the boat, because there was no timber out on the Great Plains and there were no navigable rivers. And as a result, he wrote one of the greatest books ever written on the American West and Great Plains, simply entitled The Great Plains to Set the Record Straight. Webb declared that anybody using the same farming techniques they used east of the Mississippi River and they tried to use the same ones west of the Mississippi River, was doomed to failure. The Great Plains, he said, had no trees, high wind, little water, and the ground was very hard. Wallace Stegner, later in a great book, Beyond the 100th Meridian, echoed the views of Webb. Today, Los Angeles has a local water supply capable of supporting 8% of its population, San Diego 10%, Denver 20%, and Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, Lubbock, and many other Western and Colorado cities, much less. Colorado averages 17 inches of rain a year, often overlooked because of the great amount of water that runs off the mountains in the spring. The western slope of Colorado, the western 1/3, has 10% of the state population, 33% of the land area, and 80% of the water. And therein lie many tales of woe. And they say, the water is where the people ain't, and the people ain't where the water is. Whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting. The South Platte River, too thick to drink, too thin to plow. Water is the most cussed and discussed topic in the West. And ex-Governor John Love, water runs uphill towards money. 40 million people in 7 states rely on Colorado River water. And there you got a great shot of the Hoover Dam backing up Lake Mead. And the same depend on it for electricity. There are 15 dams and 80 water diversions on the Colorado River, which no longer flows to the Gulf of California and the Pacific Ocean. Early irrigation in Colorado began around the year 1 at Mesa Verde and the Four Corners region, which includes Hovenweep in Utah, Kayenta, Arizona, Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, and of course, Mesa Verde, Colorado. The Indians at Mesa Verde irrigated the top of the mesa, terraced the ravines down to the valley floor, and had reservoirs and ditches on the valley floor. They left southwest Colorado in the Four Corners because of a 27-year drought from 1272 to 1299. Early Mexican farming ditches then ran from streams to bottomlands in southern Colorado in the 1850s. The San Luis Ditch is the oldest in Colorado, dating back to 1851. Other early ditches came at Hardscrabble Creek near Florence, Fountain Creek, Greenhorn Creek near Rye, and Conejos Creek in the San Luis Valley. They were all small affairs and used by retired mountain men or Mexican farmers. In 1861, following the Colorado Gold Rush, David Wall irrigated 2 acres of land near Golden and found that crops he raised were tremendous. If you could get water on it, the crops would be great. Wall made good money selling his produce to the mining camps up Clear Creek Canyon, like Central City and Georgetown. 9 years later in 1870, Nathan Meeker, with support from great newspaper man and owner and editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, began the Union Colony, where Greeley is located today. With more men to work collectively, Meeker dug canals from the Platte and Poudre rivers and moved water farther away from the bottomland. Water was now taken to bench lands, irrigating more land than ever before. With more and more water taken out of streams, early settlers found that especially later in the year, there wasn't enough water for irrigation. This led to the pumping of water from underground aquifers, the most famous and largest of which is the Ogallala Aquifer, including eastern Colorado and adjoining states. That aquifer covers 174,000 square miles and has as much water in it as Lake Huron. The windmill, taking advantage of the prairie winds, which averaged 10 to 12 miles an hour, made the pumping possible. Later, gas-powered pumps allowed for more water to be pumped up from the aquifer, leading to over $20 billion of food being produced. Unfortunately, as time passed, aquifers began to get depleted and the water table dropped alarmingly. Aquifers in eastern Colorado and the Great Plains shrank twice as fast from 2011 to 16 as in the previous 60 years. And once an aquifer is depleted, it takes a long time to recover. Around the US today and world aquifers are in big trouble. With water at a premium, Kansas and other Great Plains states came up with an idea, the Great Canal. That canal would pump Missouri River water 300 miles uphill to arid areas in the west, including eastern Colorado. However, the estimated cost of $20 billion and the cost of energy to do it coming in at $500 million a year quashed that idea for now. Many have brought up Thomas Malthus with regard to the expanding population in Colorado and the West. Malthus in 1799 said in a great book called Essay on the Principles of Population that food supply goes up arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Population, he says, goes up geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc. Eventually, said Malthus, the food supply cannot keep up with the population, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse ride: war, famine, disease, and death. By 1900, the Uncompahgre Valley on Colorado's western slope, and you're looking at it right there in the 1890s when it didn't have a whole lot of water. The Uncompahgre Valley, including the towns of Montrose, Olathe, Kelowna, Pea Green, were going dry, and ranchers and farmers began to leave. There wasn't enough water in the Uncompahgre River, 175,000 acres that could be irrigated, but only enough water for 35,000 from the Uncompahgre River. That led the newly formed Bureau of Reclamation to engage in its first great reclamation project. The Bureau had been started just after 1900 and was designed to reclaim arid western lands. The Uncompahgre project involved the building of a 6-mile underground tunnel underneath Vernal Mesa, which separated the Gunnison River in the famous Black Canyon with the Uncompahgre River in the valley. We found out that the Gunnison River in the canyon was higher than the Uncompahgre Valley, so water could run through the tunnel via gravity. Hundreds of men worked from the east or river portal in the canyon, and Luani or west portal, 8 miles from Montrose, building the famous Gunnison Tunnel. And there you can see the tunnel with the wooden structure and tracks running down the middle. That was used during the construction period. The construction of the Gunnison Tunnel went on from 1904 to 9, and when crews met in the middle, they were less than an inch off. President William Howard Taft came to Luani in September of 1909 and threw the switch that started water flowing. There's a picture of a car I was in that went through the 6-mile tunnel in late fall. And if you got any claustrophobia, you don't want to do that because they open the gates on both ends and you're able to drive through to check things out. There's obviously only a little water going through at that time. The water running through the Gunnison Tunnel saved the farmers, the ranchers, and the towns of the Uncompahgre Valley and marked a new era in land reclamation for Colorado and the West. It was the first great Bureau of Reclamation project in history. And there you can see the celebration going on in Montrose, September 23rd, 1909, the starting of the Uncompahgre Tunnel. Water was now proven to be the lifeblood of Colorado and the West. And as population increased and water became limited, Western states fought each other for it in the courts. And they also fought each other for it in the state of Colorado. And that engaged in trans-mountain water diversion. As more and more people came into Denver and the Front Range after World War I, the Bureau of Reclamation now decided it was time to divert water from the western slope under the Continental Divide and bring it to the growing Front Range. This led to a series of trans-mountain water diversions. The first big one was the Moffat Tunnel in 1928, taking water out of the Fraser River in Middle Park on the western slope and running it through a 6-mile underground tunnel, which parallels Amtrak's railroad tunnel today. The water wound up being used by a growing Denver. In 1937 came the granddaddy of them all, the Colorado Big Thompson Project. Work would go on in that project from 1937 to 1953 because World War II intervened. The Bureau of Reclamation project cost $160 million, and it diverted Colorado River water at Grand Lake on the western slope through a 13.3-mile Alva Adams tunnel underneath Rocky Mountain National Park into Estes Park and Lake Estes. And from there, it flowed down the Big Thompson River to be used for irrigation out on the eastern slope. Of the 500,000 acre-feet of water diverted from the western slope every year, I should say, the Colorado Big Thompson Project has the right to divert 310,000 acre-feet out of the 500,000. And an acre-foot of water is 1 foot of water covering 1 acre. The third Trans Mountain water diversion was the Roberts Tunnel, and that tunnel was built from 1958 to 62. It dammed up the Blue River. It created Lake Dillon near Silverthorne, and from there, a 23-mile underground tunnel was constructed, and water was taken from the Dillon Reservoir to a branch of the South Platte River near Grant on Highway 285. When you go by Grant on Highway 285 today, you look on the left going to Denver and you see a big white tunnel opening. One more major diversion was the Frying Pan, Arkansas project, built from 1962 to 74. That one took water from the Frying Pan River near Basalt on the western slope, created the Rudeye Reservoir for use on the western slope, and then drove a 6-mile-long Boosted Tunnel underneath Hagerman Pass, with the water going into Turquoise Lake near Leadville, and then down the Arkansas River all the way into Pueblo and southeastern Colorado. Today, there are 38 Trans Mountain water diversions, carrying 500,000 acre-feet of water from the western slope to the eastern slope. Now to the court cases. The first major court case involving western water was Kansas versus Colorado, and that went before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1901. It would not be decided until 1907. This involved the Arkansas River, which heads off Fremont Pass, 11 miles north of Leadville. It also involved 2 different water doctrines. Much of Kansas used the doctrine of riparian rights. That doctrine states that anybody living on a river has the right to use the water as it passes by his or her property, with 2 exceptions. 1, you can't take so much out of the river that you stop steamboats from operating. And 2, you can't take so much out that you stop mill wheels from turning. Well, obviously, this is a doctrine for a water-rich area where nobody's worried about using water out of rivers like the Mississippi or the Ohio or the Tennessee. That wasn't going to fly in the West in Colorado. And Colorado used the doctrine of prior appropriation, the doctrine for an arid land. It had 2 rules. One was first in time, first in use. Whoever had the earliest water right on the river had the right to use the last amount of water if it went dry. And secondly was the concept, use it or lose it. No one could hoard water in an arid land. If you couldn't use it, you had to give it up to somebody who could. That was the water right used west of the Mississippi. Kansas sued Colorado for taking so much water out of the Arkansas River that it didn't have enough for its farmers, ranchers, or cities later in the year. And it demanded an end to diversions in Colorado. Colorado demanded that it had the right of international law, that it controlled all rivers which headed in the state, such as the Arkansas. If accepted by the Supreme Court, international law would have meant that Colorado could control the waters of the Arkansas, the Colorado, the South Platte, and the Rio Grande, all which headed in the state. Colorado defended itself by telling the court that Kansas was also taking water out of the Arkansas River and depriving Oklahoma farmers downstream. On top of that, Kansas also used prior appropriation in the drier or western part of the state. Kansas appeared to be talking out of both sides of its mouth. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Colorado, saying that Kansas couldn't prove that it had been harmed. But ominously, it also came up with a doctrine called Equitable Apportionment. That doctrine declared that it didn't make any difference where a river headed, that everybody on the river had a right to a share. That was a blow to Colorado's international law. That court case took 6 years, cost a lot of money, and neither side got what it wanted. Litigation was going to be expensive, but it appeared to be the only way to solve water disputes in the western states. However, it would take one more Supreme Court case to show western states that lawsuits were not the way to go. And that case was Wyoming versus Colorado, which took 11 years from 1911 to 22. In this case, Colorado wanted to divert water from the Laramie Basin and run it into the Poudre Basin near Fort Collins as the population increased there. The Laramie River heads in Wyoming and runs into Colorado. This plan, which involved moving water from one basin to another, would have made it impossible for the return flow. The return flow involves diverted water, which finds its way back to the main stream, and 50% of all irrigated water goes back into the stream. But if you take it out of one basin and move it into another basin, it's not going to get back into the original basin. This case involved two states who both used the doctrine of prior appropriation, unlike the Kansas case. The Supreme Court ruled that water could be diverted from one basin to another, but only if the basin getting the water had prior water rights. Because the Poudre Basin and the people of Fort Collins only had rights to 15,500 acre-feet of water from the Laramie River, that wasn't enough to warrant building a diversion tunnel. The people on the Laramie River in Wyoming had prior rights. That case took 11 years, cost more money, and decided little. It was now obvious to Colorado and western states that litigation or lawsuits was not the solution to their western water problems. The states involved with the Colorado River Basin were also now very worried because the federal government was trying to claim all unappropriated water in the west unnavigable streams. The only answer to the problem was an interstate treaty. The 7 states involved with the Colorado River and its tributaries would have to agree amongst themselves who got what amount of water. During the hot summer of 1922 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, representatives of the 7 states on the Colorado River gathered with Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover in charge to work out a compact which would divide up the waters of the Colorado River. Colorado was very fortunate to have as his representative Delph Carpenter of Greeley, and you're looking at him right there, one of the great top water lawyers of the nation. Carpenter believed there were 2 major threats to Western and Colorado water rights. Number 1, the federal government saying it had the rights to surplus water in Colorado and Western interstate streams. And secondly, the fear of a Supreme Court ruling stating how much water each state would get. Carpenter believed in state control over water, and he also believed that every drop of water that runs into the sea without yielding a full commercial return is an economic loss. Carpenter in particular was alarmed by the growth of Los Angeles by 1922. 500,000 people there, with the Imperial Valley having a great need of water for irrigation. Under the doctrine of prior appropriation, California would be in line for much of Colorado's river's water. Carpenter was also alarmed over the federal government talking about building a dam on the Colorado River near Henderson, Nevada, for flood control, power generation, and irrigation. He demanded that a compact be signed, which would give upper basin states on the river a share of its flow, regardless of whether the states had yet put it to beneficial use. A compact could do just that. It could set up the law of the river, which was a big end around the doctrine of prior appropriation. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 was agreed upon by the states on the Colorado River and is studied by nations around the world even today. And there again is Lee's Ferry. The compact did the following. Number one, the 7 states on the Colorado River were divided into upper basin and lower basin, with the dividing line at Lee's Ferry near Page in northern Arizona. That is where a Mormon missionary named John Lee ferried people across the river in the old days. The lower basin states were California, Nevada, and Arizona. That's where the Colorado River flowed to. The upper basin states were Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming, and that's where the Colorado River and the tributaries headed. Secondly, it was assumed that the Colorado River produced 20 million acre-feet of water every year. Although scientific studies had indicated that figure was high, politics now got in the way. Number 3, the length of the contract would be in perpetuity, forever. Carpenter did not want the federal government or the courts to ever be able to change it. Number 4, the upper basin states agreed to allow 75 million acre-feet of water to go by Lee's Ferry every 10 years, or 7.5 million every year on the average. That would theoretically leave 5 million acre-feet in surplus, because in the studies, it indicated we had 20 million acre-feet to deal with. Number 5, any excess water would go to the area of greatest need. No one then could foresee the growth of lower basin states. And without air conditioning being invented, very few people would ever have lived in Phoenix, Las Vegas, Lubbock, or Tucson. You wouldn't have 9 men named Claude living in Las Vegas if there wasn't for air conditioning. Number 6, navigation and power were secondary to domestic and agricultural use. And number 7 and last, Mexico would get 1.5 million acre-feet of water a year, taken equally from the upper and lower basin allotments. Each one would have to kick in 750,000 acre-feet, because obviously Mexico is on the Colorado River. The upper basin states gained a lot by getting around the doctrine of prior appropriation, but we were also hurt in 2 ways. Number 1, since 1922, only 14 million acre-feet of water has come from the Colorado River. So our share of the river has only been 6.5 million acre-feet a year. And secondly, the area of greatest need since 1922 has been in those lower basin states with their great population increases. However, Delph Carpenter, following the Colorado River Compact being signed, declared, and I quote, "In the Colorado River Compact, 7 states had taken advantage of a moment in history that would never again reappear. It should never be reopened, amended, or revised. Keep it in perpetuity, forever." The Colorado River today is the most important river in the United States, even though it's only 6th in acre-feet of water. It is most important because it is the only real source of water in the Southwest. In 1948, the Upper Colorado River Basin Act was passed, with upper basin states deciding who would get how much water from the Colorado River. Colorado got 51.75% of the upper basin allotment. Utah, 23%, Wyoming, 14%, New Mexico, 11%. And one more thing about the Colorado River Compact. In a famous court case, Winters versus the U.S., Supreme Court case of 1908, the court ruled that Native Americans had water rights on their reservations. And just because the Colorado River Compact later ignored that, didn't eliminate them. By the 1950s, it was obvious that there was a great need for storage of water in the upper basin, so it could deliver water to the lower basin when needed later in the year after spring runoff. The upper basin also wanted storage of water for itself later in the year. And this led to the Upper Colorado River Storage Act of 1956, led through Congress by Western Slope Congressman and head of the House Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, Wayne Aspinall. His committee was responsible for all land and water legislation in the West. And I got a chance to know Congressman Aspinall very well because he came to our water workshops every summer. And he usually knew more than the experts testifying before his committee. And one great story, Phil Burton, who was a Democrat from California once and on Aspinall's committee, once was quoted in the paper as saying that Aspinall's committee was run so tightly you had to raise your hands to go to the bathroom. And that was true. Aspinall had Burton in his office at 8 the next morning. He said, "Phil, is this true?" Burton said, "Yeah, Mr. Chairman, but I was kind of kidding." And Wayne Aspinall said, "Phil, you live in San Diego and you got a harbor bill out there you need money for, right?" Phil Burton said, "Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do." And Wayne Aspinall said, "Do I make myself clear?" There are not going to be any more smart ass comments about how I run my committee. The Upper Colorado River Storage Act called for the building of 6 dams in the upper basin states. And there's Morrow Point. And it's a kind of overfilling, which is not very often that happens. That was 1974. The act called for the building of 6 dams in the upper basin states, 3 on the Gunnison River, Blue Mesa, Morrow Point that you're looking at in Crystal, the Navajo Dam on the San Juan River near Farmington, New Mexico, Flaming Gorge on the Green River in Wyoming, and Glen Canyon at Page, Arizona. The act also called for the building of projects in the upper basin, such as the Paonia Reservoir, Crawford Reservoir, and Ridgeway Reservoir. And there's an ice skater skating on the ice in the Black Canyon. Today, in 2021, the water situation in Colorado and the West is dire. The Colorado River is over-appropriated. There's not enough water to supply the 40 million people who depend upon it. Mountain snowpack in the West has declined 15% in the last 20 years, and Colorado River flows are down nearly 20%. Colorado in 2021 is in what experts call extreme drought. There's my good friend Bruce Bartles and his wife Deirdre ice skating on Lake San Cristobal about 3 years ago. Fights over water and in Colorado and the West today involve industry, agriculture, recreation, cities, environmentalists, power companies, the federal government, and land developers. Our water supply today depends on 3 interconnected sources: snow, rivers, and groundwater. And underground aquifers in Colorado have been severely depleted, causing a great problem for the future. We have to accept the fact today that we live in an arid land and act accordingly. The day is fast approaching when we may see the great eastward movement, when people have to leave Colorado in the West and move to where the water is. There is the Blue Mesa Reservoir. You're actually looking at the Gunnison River and the Lake City Bridge in the background. and you can drive 3 miles right next to the Gunnison River before the water backs up today. President Gerald Ford once declared in Mountaineer Bowl that education costs a lot, but ignorance costs a lot more. The only thing that stops growth and more population in Colorado is economics. When water bills rise to thousands of dollars a month, that'll stop growth. A lot of people would like to live in Aspen or Vail or even Crested Butte, but with the average price of a house in the millions, they can't afford it. The Western Slope, where 80% of the water is, and the Western Slope, which wants it, will continue to fight each other. And the Western Slope view of the Front Range is colored by previous trans-mountain diversions of the past, when the Eastern Slope said, "What's mine is mine, and what's yours is negotiable." The major problem today regarding water may be climate change. The National Research Council said recently that the Earth is the hottest it has been in 400 years, and it declared, "Climate change and soaring population across the Southwest threatens to overwhelm the main water source for millions." The Colorado Basin is going to face costly, controversial, and unavoidable trade-off choices, along with demands threatening the area's ability to cope with droughts and water shortages. So, in conclusion, water, the lifeblood of Colorado, and not enough of it. What does the future hold? And that's it on water. We now are going to get Ashley back. She's going to tell you how to answer the trivia question for a book entitled Around the Gunnison Country. So here's Ashley.
So as always, just put your answers in the chat and I will monitor them as best as I can and see who won.
Here is the trivia question for the book. First come, first serve. I want any of you folks to tell me, what is the largest trans-mountain water diversion in Colorado? And we await the answer. Brad Johnson says, Vicky Fightmaster says the Big Thompson. She's got it.
Okay.
Vicky's got the Big Thompson.
Okay.
Now, Vicky, I know you got one of my books. So if you want to give it away to somebody else, you'll let me know. Otherwise, we're going to get your address and we're going to send it to you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, after that water lecture, which was kind of sobering, are there any questions on water? Any questions or comments? Happy to answer. Don't be shy. Any questions on water or comments? Thank you, Kimberly. Yeah, it's sobering, and we got a lot of tough times to come.
What percent?
Please repeat the 4 books you mentioned. I'm happy to do it. Norris Hundley, Hundley, Water and the West. That's about the Colorado River Compact, is fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Mark. That is part of the problem, Phoenix growing so fast. The second book is Mark Reisner, Reisner, and it's called The Cadillac Desert. The third one is John Kuhn, Kuhn, Science Be Damned, Dammed. And the other one is by a man named John Poccitelli, Poccoceli. And it's called Water, a Biography from. Charles Olathe gets its water from the Gunnison Tunnel. The Uncompahgre water users own the water in the Taylor Reservoir, and they can call for it anytime they want. If you don't have a well, where do you get your water in Gunnison? Well, some mostly comes from the well, but we've got a couple of huge storage tanks in Gunnison, and we got 7 major wells, and that produces the water.
I did have a question before that about the books. It's from M. Ellis. It's what percentage of water is used for people versus agriculture?
80% of all water in Colorado is used for agriculture.
And then the next question is, they're coming in quick. Is from Charles. Where does Olathe get its water from for all the?
Yeah, I just mentioned that one, and they get it from the Gunnison Tunnel. They own the water in the Pueblo Reservoir, which was built in 1937, 106,200 acre feet. And that's the water that goes through the Gunnison Tunnel into the Uncompahgre Valley. Yeah, Tempe's got a good point. Arizona's share of water is going to be cut by 18%. And we're in the process of California, Nevada, and Arizona having to cut. And the upper basin states are going to have to cut also, unless we get out of this damn drought. Any other questions or comments?
Roy says, before working on the Colorado River Compact, Delph Carpenter was a primary party in the creation of the La Plata River Compact. That's his comment.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you.
I think it's Catherine. If you don't have a well, where do you get your water from in Gunnison?
Well, you better have a well. And we, as I said, we got 2 huge storage tanks too, where the one of them above Western's Cupola Hill.
Brad Johnson says, Where the Water Goes by David Owen is another good book. Patricia says, mind-boggling, too many people, Blue Mesa is shocking. Suzanne comments, agriculture in Arizona uses more water than domestic uses. And Tempe says, Arizona's share of water will be cut by 18% or 51,000 to, wait, I can't, what does that say? 51,000, or no, 512,000 acre feet in 2022. Agriculture will be affected the most.
Yeah.
And Bill says, great presentation, Dr. B.
Well, thank you. Any other questions or comments, folks? Yeah, Judy, thank you very much. Appreciate you having on board.
Tempe asks, in Arizona, it is legal to harvest water, but don't think it is in Colorado. And I don't think it is in Colorado.
Yeah, I don't think so either. One thing I'll say about Las Vegas, that they probably are doing the best of any city in terms of conservation. Do I see desalination as a solution? No, not at this time. They've tried that a little bit out around San Diego. It's too expensive right now, and just a lot of difficulties. The technology is really not there. Any other comments or questions, everybody? Yeah, Brenda, thank you very much. Yep, thanks, Jack. Good to have you on board from Colorado History. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Any other comments or questions? Go ahead and hit. Do you see the historic, Rich, put that up on the board again, that question from Rich and Phyllis Guerreri.
I can read it to you. Do you see the historic allocations to agriculture being reduced in favor of domestic use, particularly in California?
Yeah, Rich, unfortunately, I do. They're already, they're selling water, they're banking water on the stock exchange, and water rights are very valuable. And I think that, that might happen. I hate to see it happen, but it might. Kind of depends on how much water we can get in the West.
Mark says, what about the impact of bottled water corporations?
Well, they've had a big controversy over that with Nestle Water and Salida. I don't think bottled water uses that much water. So that's probably a minor use of the water.
Barbie Adams says, is there a Gunnison Tunnel location between Montrose and Delta?
No, the Gunnison Tunnel runs from the Black Canyon. If you go into Cimarron, you drive down, you can drive down pretty much to the east portal. And then it comes out 8 miles from Montrose. People drive right by it and never notice it. I've been through the tunnel twice.
I think it's Martin. I can't see his full name or her, but how does a farmer know how much water he can take from a ditch and how is it accounted for?
Well, that's because of head gates, and the ranchers can tell a lot more than I can, but you got water commissioners and people who check on that very carefully. So that's very sophisticated, and it all deals with head gates and what water rights you have. Is it worth spending money to improve soil health, to reduce? Absolutely. And it may come to that. There's a lot of conservation practices that we can engage in that we haven't used yet, but we're getting there.
I also have some questions in the Q&A, Duane. Michelle asks, what crops grown in Colorado uses the most water?
Well, that's a question for probably the scientists. There are some that use more than others. I'm going to have to plead ignorance on that. I don't know. I'll try and find that out next time, though.
And then Peter Dunda, hello, Peter, asks, who controls how much water is released from the Pueblo Reservoir down the Arkansas?
Yeah, that's all Bureau of Reclamation, Pete. The water comes through the Homestead Tunnel and goes down there, and that is all controlled by the Bureau of Reclamation. I think we're getting to the end here. I want to remind everybody again of two things. Remember, next week, it's polka time, music time in Colorado with Pete Dunda. And we're doing it on Wednesday, not Thursday. Thursday's the ghost stories at the museum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
almonds use more water than grapes. Thank you, Sharon. I think that's right. I think I read that one time. Yes, almonds do use a lot of water.
And just so everyone knows, when you get your updates in your email from Zoom for the webinar, I have changed it, so you'll get the update on Tuesday, just so you're aware. And if it doesn't show, please email me at curator@crestofbuettemuseum.com, just so I can make sure.
And Vicki will give your address to Ashley so I can get your book on the way. Everybody else, thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you all next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. Yeah, Suzanne, you've been regular, so we have to give you an excused absence the next couple of weeks. All right, folks. Oh, going to Hawaii. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, great. Yeah, Kimberly, thank you. Vicki, there's Vicki's address, Ashley. You can get it. Jamie, thank you. And tell Ray hi for me.
Vicki, if you could just
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
in the box as well, just so I can have a record of your email. Or you can send it to me privately at curator@museum.com.
Suzanne, thank you very much. All right, everybody, this is Vandenbusche over and out, and I'll see everybody on Wednesday.
Bye.
Goodbye.